Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started in just a moment. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started for today. So just to make sure that we're all keeping track, especially for myself, it is Friday. It is the 24th of April, 2020, and this is the weekly Zoom meeting for the Springs 2020 edition of Political Science 1H. So several things that we're going to be going ahead and getting into today. First thing is I'll be going ahead and just giving a couple of quick announcements, reminders, that sort of thing. After that, we'll go ahead and I'll ask for any questions that you might have about the information that we went over last week, an overview that I gave you for the notes dealing with the first of the three national government branches that we're going to be working on in this section of the course. That is talking a little bit about the U.S. Congress. And remember, Congress is the subject of the discussion forum post that you are currently working on. That is due at 11:59 p.m. tonight, not counting, of course, the automatic 72-hour grace period. So I'll deal with any questions, comments, problems that you have dealing with the U.S. Congress. And then after that, I'll go ahead and give you a bit of an overview of the notes that I've posted for you on Canvas yesterday, dealing with the assignment that the discussion forum post assignment that you're going to be working on this week between now and next Friday, which deals with the second of the three national government branches that the framers created back in 1787 in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And that, of course, is the presidency. And obviously, in every semester, I have a lot to say about the presidency. Seems like this semester and for the last several semesters, I've had even more to say because let's face it, the presidency of our 45th president, Donald Trump, whether you support him, whether you're indifferent about him, whether you can't stand him, whatever your position on the current president, I think that everyone can agree that this has not been a typical or conventional presidency. I'll try and pepper a little bit of that in to that overview of the Congress notes that I will be going over today. And of course, I'll deal with your questions or comments about any subject having to do with the class or anything else that's on your mind as we go along. So that's pretty much the agenda for today. So before we get into anything else, let me just remind you, of course, that this our get together this morning, as it is on every Friday morning, is being recorded, and you can go ahead and access the recording of this meeting normally about 12 to 24 hours after the recording ends. And you can go ahead and access that by clicking on the ConferZoom link in the left-hand menu of our Canvas page, and then clicking on the recordings link, finding the link for today's meeting, clicking on that. And then the new twist, the new wrinkle that's been added, you'll be prompted to put in the password that I gave you in the Canvas announcement yesterday so that you could access today's meeting live. Put in that same password when prompted to do so by Zoom, and then you can access the recording for the meeting for today. So speaking of that, I am working, and hopefully in the next couple of days, I'm going to come up with a workaround. Now that Canvas is requiring passwords for all, Canvas, Zoom is requiring passwords for all of our meetings this semester, even though we are securely behind our Canvas firewall. I'm going to try and figure out a workaround that will allow me to issue a single password that will be good for the remainder of our Friday morning get-togethers between now and the end of the semester. So as soon as I get more information about that, I'll send you a Canvas announcement so you know what's going on as well. And I apologize for the complications, surrounding the Zoom meetings and the recordings and that sort of thing. Other things that I want to mention before we get into dealing with any questions that you may have about the U.S. Congress. First of all, your tests. I'm working on those now. Actually, I'm going to start working on them a little bit later on today. And Sean Anthony says in the chat that he didn't need a password to get in here. Well, if that's the case, that's somehow magic, because generally speaking, Canvas is now requiring these things. So I'm not quite sure how you stuck through the firewall there, but just to be on the safe side.
I also didn't need a password for some reason.
Okay, that's really strange, because this means that Canvas is being rather inconsistent. But anyway, just to make sure, I am always going to be posting in advance passwords so that you can get into these meetings without any problem, and you can access the recordings without any problem. Because I know one of my other classes earlier in the week, before we realized this change had been made, I had nobody show up for my Canvas meeting. I'm thinking, okay, that's weird. What's happening? And then all of a sudden, emails started coming in from students saying that they were prompted for a password. They'd never been asked for one before. So Canvas is being inconsistent. I mean, Zoom is being inconsistent. So anyway, I will provide you with passwords regardless, just in case. So there never is a problem with you getting in either to these live meetings or for the recordings as well. So we're just going to roll with it as best we can. Zoom is proving to be kind of the wild, wild west as far as technology goes, but we are kind of stuck with it for the rest of the semester. So there you go. Now, a couple other things as I was just starting to mention, I'm going to start working on your tests a little bit later on today. The tests rolled in perhaps a little bit slower than I was expecting. And so I didn't want to start working on them until I received most of them. Because obviously when I assess your tests or any other assignment in this class, I kind of take a look at a number of tests first before I kind of start getting my head around how I'm going to actually evaluate, how I'm going to grade, that sort of thing. So I will start working on those later today. So you should start seeing some scores populating on Canvas in the very near future. All right. And the other announcement, of course, that I wanted to remind you about, an ongoing thing, is that, obviously for the rest of the semester, in addition to your being able to communicate with me during these weekly Zoom meetings that's exclusively for our class, as well as your ability to always send me a Canvas message or an email whenever you need to or want to, there are also now the twice weekly virtual student hours that are available for all of my classes this semester. And I've sent you Canvas announcements about this. I talked about this during our live Zoom last week. And those are Monday and Wednesday afternoons between 2:30 and 3:30. And if you want to Zoom in, and remember, there's no lecturing or anything like that going on during the virtual student hours. It's simply the one-on-one questions, the kind of thing that you would do if we were still face-to-face and you came in during one of my student hours, came by my office with a question or something you wanted to talk about, that sort of thing. So the Canvas link and the password that you do need, if you are going to go ahead and access the student hours, is listed on our Canvas homepage. If you scroll down our homepage, just past the picture where it says basic course information, you will go ahead and find that link and that password. And again, that's Monday and Wednesday from 2:30 until 3:30 Pacific Daylight Time. And I know that a couple of you have conflicts. You have other live Zoom meetings during those times. So if you want to go ahead and do a face-to-face appointment, a face-to-face meeting on Zoom, just let me know. Send me a Canvas message or an email. Give me some days and times during the week that work for you, and we'll set something up, and I will then send you an invitation to attend a one-on-one appointment with me, and we can work it out that way. Okay. So any questions, comments, problems about any of that stuff that I've just talked about, or anything else having to do with the class before we go ahead and move forward for this morning? Anybody? And again, you can always open up your mic, ask a question, make a comment, or put something in the group chat. Anybody? Okay, so let's go ahead and get onto the main agenda for today. And as I said, first item that we want to deal with is to deal with any questions or comments that you have about the topic that you are working on currently for this week's discussion forum post dealing with the U.S. Congress. And remember that discussion forum post is due this evening, 11:59 p.m., not counting, of course, the automatic 3-day or 72-hour grace period that applies to all of our assignments in this class for the semester. So if you recall, if you were with us during our live Zoom last week, you'll remember that I went ahead and kind of gave you a broad overview of the notes that I posted for you on Canvas dealing with the U.S. Congress. I also kind of gave you a bit more of a broader context, kind of talked a little bit about the main point that we are dealing with between now, over the next couple of weeks, as we talk first about the U.S. Congress, then about the presidency, and then about the federal court system. We talked about the fact that when the framers were designing the Constitution back in 1787, and specifically when they were creating the three-branch system of government that we have at the national level through separation of powers and checks and balances, that the framers had this fundamental assumption. They assumed that this separation of powers system would work most effectively if the three national government branches, again, Congress, the president, and the courts, were all roughly co-equal in terms of their level of power and authority. And one of the points that I emphasized in our live Zoom last week was the fact that as we moved from 1789, when our current U.S. Constitution became official, became the law of the land in the United States, and moving forward through history until the present day, at some point, we began to see a significant imbalance in power and authority begin to arise amongst the three national government branches. And it's interesting because when the framers created the Constitution, they had really specific ideas, as we talked a little bit about last week, about which of the three branches would have the least potential to become overly powerful and potentially abusive of their power, as well as the branches that they felt had the greatest potential to become the most powerful and the most potentially abusive of their powers. And they acted accordingly based on those gut feelings that they had. And that really has contributed to the significant changes that we've seen in the relative power levels of Congress, the president, and the courts over time. Okay, so that's kind of just a reminder in case you weren't with us last Friday, kind of the main point that we're operating from as we talk about Congress and then the president and the courts. So does that make sense to us so far? Any questions or comments about any of that? Yeah.
Yeah, I did. So the main reason why they were stressed about Congress having more power or being more corrupt than the other two branches of legislation had to do with the fact that the people were voting these people directly in, correct?
In part, that's true. And remember, as we talked about last week, the framers were trying to hedge their bets as much as they could. And so that's why, at least originally, in the original design of the Constitution, the upper house of Congress, the Senate, wasn't directly elected by the people, right? It was appointed by each state's legislature, each state's version of Congress. And the thought was that elected officials at the state level hopefully would be able to do a better job of picking smarter, more honest members for the Senate than voters could. Now, obviously, as we talked about early on in the semester, back when we were still face to face, it didn't actually work out that way. That, you know, by the early 20th century, by like 1905, the Senate was actually way more corrupt than the U.S. House. And so because of that, you know, in the early 20th century, we went ahead and did something that's really difficult to do. We amended the Constitution and required that senators be elected directly by voters in their state. So the framers didn't trust the voters, so they tried to create kind of this hybrid system, if you will, for the U.S. Congress. So that reflects part of their concern over the possibility of Congress spinning out of control. But I think another part of their concern kind of goes back to something else that we talked about towards the beginning of the semester. And that's the fact that as the framers sat down first to design the Articles of Confederation in 1776, and then to create our current Constitution in 1787, they still had that really bad case, essentially, of PTSD from living under the control of what they thought was an out of control British legislative body, the British Parliament, specifically the British House of Commons. And so I think that part of the fear of a Congress spinning out of control was kind of a carryover, kind of a hangover, if you will, from the incredible fear that they had of the British Parliament back when they were still, you know, a series of 13 British colonies. So does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
I just wanted to clarify.
Oh, no problem at all. I always appreciate the clarifying questions because I'm not always clear. So there you go. So any other questions, comments, problems, etc., about anything having to do with the notes that you've been given on Congress, the assigned reading that you've had on Congress, or any of the videos dealing with Congress? Yeah, go ahead.
Another question.
Sure.
So the article that you gave us from the LA Times about Brexit, can you extrapolate a little bit more on that and how that relates to sort of what we're talking? Is that like were you showing us that to exemplify the fact that like the British Parliament is set up in such a way that is more challenging than here, or that they have an issue that is reflective of an issue that we could have here, or like how does that relate to this?
Well, so I think there were a number of things going on in that article. I think that, you know, one element of the article, and one of the elements that I hope that you would draw from the article, you know, was the fact that in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised if we perceive the U.S. Congress to be a relatively weak player within our separation of powers system, as opposed to the British Parliament, because remember, the British system is the exact opposite of ours, right? We have separation of powers and checks and balances. They have fusion of powers, so that under the British system, the British Parliament contains elements of all three of the major functions that every national government has to engage in. So the British Parliament, of course, has the legislative function. It is the lawmaker for the British government. But the British Parliament also has something that our Congress doesn't have. It also holds the executive function. Not only is Parliament responsible for making national government laws in Britain, but it's also responsible for enforcing those laws once they are made. And so the Parliament, but specifically led by the Prime Minister, holds that executive authority, holds the executive authority essentially that the president of the United States would have in our separation of powers system. And at the same time, though it doesn't have a lot of authority in this regard, the parliament does hold a little bit of judicial authority as well. And remember, the judicial power is the ability of government to be able to interpret the laws, to tell government and the people what the laws actually mean in practice. And under the fusion of powers system, Parliament does have some ability to interpret the laws, to interpret the British Constitution. Now, that's kind of a trick in itself, to interpret the British Constitution, because technically there isn't a written British Constitution. Instead, the British Constitution is kind of this weird hybrid of some very historically important written documents in the early history of Great Britain. For example, the Magna Carta, going back to very early British history, which essentially establishes the basic rights of the British people, as opposed to the rights of British officials, the king, that sort of thing. Tries to provide some limit on governmental authority, and other historic documents, plus some oral tradition as well. The British Constitution is partially oral, kind of carried on in oral tradition, passed on from generation to generation. So, you can imagine interpreting that kind of crazy hybrid constitution can be really something of a challenge. So because of the fusion of powers system, on the one hand, the British Parliament has a lot more authority than the US Congress does from day to day, being just simply the legislative branch in our separation of powers system. However, the article does point out that there are some similarities between the British model and that of the US Congress, and so that just if Parliament could get bogged down on an incredibly complex and controversial issue like Brexit, certainly Congress could easily get bogged down by complex and controversial issues as well. And that's become more of an issue in the US Congress in recent decades, as we've seen greater levels of partisan and ideological polarization, not just in the American electorate, but amongst members of Congress themselves, right? And really, I think that if you want kind of a great example of the kind of legislative and policy gridlock, kind of a breakdown and an inability to compromise, you are certainly seeing that playing out now in real time in terms of congressional responses to various aspects of the COVID-19 crisis in the United States, which obviously, Congress just yesterday, the House of Representatives just yesterday passed a bill sent to it by the Senate, a proposed law that expands the amount of money available primarily for assistance to small businesses in the United States that have had to either close or reduce their hours, and are forced with the possibility of laying off or permanently letting go their employees. And and it's interesting, I was just reading an article talking about that latest law that the president is supposed to sign, I hope sometime today, because the small business relief is badly needed. But the article that I was reading before we came together this morning, basically said that Republicans in both houses essentially got much more of what they wanted from the bill than Democrats did, including the fact that this bill, like the first bill of its type that came a couple of weeks ago, still contains a massive loophole in it. And the loophole is, and Democrats wanted to get rid of this loophole, A lot of the money that was earmarked for small businesses in the first version of the bill, the first version of the law from a couple of weeks ago, a lot of that money actually ended up going to large corporations because of this loophole, which basically said that, you know, if you are a business owner, if you hold a franchise for a major national corporation like, say, McDonald's or something like that, you would qualify for the small business assistance. You would qualify for the small business relief. And there were some really controversial examples of this. For example, you might have heard in the news about a week or so ago that the one national chain, Shake Shack, received a huge amount of money from this program, and once it became public that Shake Shack had gotten this money that was earmarked for small businesses, and that hundreds of thousands of small businesses in the U.S. didn't get any money from that law. There was so much public outcry. It was such a PR nightmare for Shake Shack that they gave the money back to the government and said, please redistribute it to other businesses that need it more than we do. So that kind of gives you an idea. And so with the second bill, Democrats got some of what they want, but not all of what they wanted by any means. And there is some talk that when a third version of the bill goes through, because this money is not going to be enough, that the Democrats, bless you, the Democrats might, you know, hold much more firm on this and really try and hold out to get some of more of what they want. And so that's the problem, because, you know, obviously, you know, as we've been seeing in the news over the past few weeks, it seems like at least some Republicans, including the president, have a very different perception of, you know, what is important in this COVID-19 crisis, what the government's proper response should be in this COVID-19 crisis, that sort of thing. And so the more polarized, the more divided your Congress is on these issues, the harder it becomes for compromise, for meaningful, reasonable compromise to take place, so that policies can get made, laws can get passed, and things can move forward in the country. So those are a couple of the issues, I think, that I was trying to have you get from that Vox piece. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And it's really helpful. What you just said is really helpful. So the prime minister in the British parliament is essentially, or in the British government, is essentially the president. Like, if we had to like sort of split the.
Well, yeah, I mean, technically there is no president, but then
right.
Technically the prime minister and the prime minister's cabinet would constitute the executive branch.
But they work in fusion with the British parliament.
Yeah.
Whereas for us, it's very separate.
Exactly. And here's the thing is, you know, neither system is perfect. Both systems, you know, the fusion of power system that they have in Britain and in every other country that was once a British colony, except for ours, we're the exception, of course. That makes sense. We're exceptional in a lot of ways, sometimes good ways and sometimes not so good ways, but you know, it's how it goes. But one of the main differences, you know, between their system and our system is that, you know, with their system, generally speaking, it is much easier for Parliament to move forward on major pieces of legislation. Brexit is a really interesting recent example of a real policy failure, I would argue, within the British parliamentary system. Normally, because the majority party in Parliament, you know, that's where the prime minister comes from, that's where the cabinet comes from. Normally, a majority party can pretty much jam through whatever public policy that it wants through Parliament and move things forward relatively quickly. Now, that ability, of course, can allow Parliament to sometimes abuse its power. And that's one of the reasons why the framers said, no, we don't like the fusion of power system. There's too much potential for abuse, so we're not going to do that. And so one of the advantages of our separation of powers system is that it is much more difficult for Congress to abuse its power and spin out of control. But on the flip side, the main disadvantage that stems from that is that it becomes much more difficult for Congress to be able to compromise between the two major parties and move forward. So neither system is ideal. Both have its own set of kind of polar opposite strengths and weaknesses. And that's just kind of how it is. Okay.
Yep.
Great. So anybody else on the US Congress before we go ahead and turn our attention to the subject you'll be working on between now and next Friday, which is really non-controversial, right? The presidency.
I had another quick question. Sorry,
Sure.
if that's okay.
That's
I'm
fine.
sorry.
No, please, that's what we're here for.
The distinction between the House of Representatives and the Senate, we had touched on that a few weeks ago with respect to the idea that the Senate, this is my understanding, that the Senate is sort of supposed to be considered more secure, more noble. They're in their position for a longer period of time. There's less of them.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a more deliberative body in the sense that, you know, since there's only 100 of them as opposed to 435 House members, and each state has equal representation. It's not unbalanced the way it is in the House. That because of all of that, the Senate is supposed to be the venue where really important controversial issues of public policy can be debated in a much less heated, much less partisan, much less ideological, and much more highly intellectual way than in the House of Representatives. Now, based on what I was just talking about a couple of minutes ago with the whole COVID-19 example, that just isn't the reality anymore. That, you know, actually, if you were to ask most political scientists who study the US Congress specifically, I think what most of them would tell you is that in some senses, the US Senate today is actually more stringently partisan on a lot of issues than is the House of Representatives. So, you know, the Congress notes did talk about the House-Senate differences, and pretty much every traditional American government textbook that's out there talks about these important House-Senate differences. And guess what? The differences still exist in a formal sense in terms of differences in numbers and differences in the complexity of rules governing each house and that sort of thing. But the actual impact of those differences is nowhere near as extreme as it used to be. Both houses are intensely partisan. Why? Because both houses are intensely divided, much more so than they used to be. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So anybody else on anything having to do with Congress before we go ahead and move on? Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit now about the presidency, and hopefully you have access to the notes that I posted for you on Canvas yesterday dealing with the presidency. And if you've had a chance to preview those, you know that they are fairly extensive. And if you've noticed, the notes on the presidency follow the same basic pattern as the notes that I provided for you dealing with the US Congress. So at the top of the notes, I talk a little bit about what was the framers' intention for the presidency when they actually sat down to create the institution of the presidency back during the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Because remember, unlike Congress, which had existed previously under the Articles of Confederation, though in significantly different form, right? Unicameral versus bicameral and all that, there was no real executive branch for the national government under the Articles of Confederation. There was no president of the United States. Technically, there was a person called the president under the Articles of Confederation, but that person was the presiding officer of Congress. They did not have executive power. So when the framers sat down to create our new separation of powers-based system in our current Constitution in 1787, they were creating the executive branch, and specifically, they were creating the presidency from scratch. They started with a completely blank piece of paper and argued a lot about the details, right? So we talk about the framers' intent for the presidency, first of all, in the notes. And then we talk a little bit about probably the most important thing that you need to understand how and why presidents do what they do. And it has to do in part with the reelection obsession that presidents have, right? And then the bulk of the presidency notes deal with the 5 basic functions, the 5 basic jobs of the presidency. And if you go down to that last sort of main section of the notes, Roman numeral number 4, the basic functions of the presidency, and you look in the parentheses there, I say always look for the chiefs. And that is just meant to be kind of a nice, easy distinction for you. So for example, when you're taking test number 3, and if you see something listed in part 1, the terms in the short answer section in part 1, and if you can't remember, you could also look at your notes, but if you can't remember if a particular function is a congressional function or a presidential function, the easiest way to distinguish between the two is that it is always a presidential function if the word chief is in the title. So chief of state, chief executive, chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, chief legislator, etc. Those are all presidential functions. So that's kind of an easy way to remember which function belongs to which branch, okay? So that's the way the notes are laid out. So what I want to do is to spend a few minutes kind of giving you a broad overview of what I think are some of the most important pieces of information contained in the presidency notes. And you can go through and take a look at those notes in more detail at your leisure. But probably the first really important element of the presidency that I need to point out for you this morning is at the very top of the notes. If you take a look at Roman numeral number 1, look what it says there. It says that having learned some hard lessons from the Articles of Confederation, yeah, you think? The framers knew that they had to create an institution like the presidency in the new Constitution and invest it with substantial authority. But here's the key bit, the key part that I really want you to remember as you go through the notes and the readings and the videos on the presidency. At the same time, however, they did not believe that the new institution had much potential to become overly powerful or overly abusive of its power. Listen to that again. At the same time, however, they did not believe that the new institution, meaning the presidency, had much potential to become too powerful or overly abusive of its power. Okay, now we'll talk about that in just a second. I just happened to look down at the chat. Sean Anthony asked, is chief taken from Native American culture or is it just a word? In the sense that the framers used it, it was just a word. Now I know that there are a lot of folks who argue that our current US Constitution was significantly based on a model of native governance, a native tribe that was partially in Canada, partially in the United States, the Iroquois. There are a lot of folks who say, well, the framers kind of ripped a lot of stuff off from the Iroquois Confederation. There's not a lot of historical evidence to indicate that that's true, though there are some similarities that we could point out. But in this sense, chief is just a word. It doesn't really have any, it wasn't significantly drawn from Native culture. Anyway, here's the key point, right? Remember how we said that when the framers sat down to create Congress, and remember when the framers started creating our current Constitution in Article 1, the framers began with Congress. They began with the legislative branch. And the reason for that, as we've already mentioned, is because the framers were most scared of Congress. They thought that Congress had the most potential to become too powerful, abuse its authority, spin out of control, and threaten people's natural rights. And so they got to Congress first thing. And that's also why, as we said, that in creating Congress in Article 1, in creating the structure and function and powers of Congress in Article 1, the framers really sweated the details. They spent a lot of time and detail trying to very carefully specify what Congress could do as well as what Congress could not do. And again, that's because they were so afraid of Congress abusing its power. But remember the implications of that. As we talked about last week in our Zoom meeting and is listed in the notes, the framers sweated the details on Congress so much. They so carefully specified what Congress could and could not do. That's why we perceive Congress today, for the most part, as being kind of a big joke. We see Congress, or at least most people see Congress, as being the weakest and least dangerous of the three national government branches. That's not what the framers thought. So how did we get from there to here? Well, because the framers feared Congress so much. They put so many limitations on Congress. That's why Congress today is kind of weak, okay? Now, contrast that with the presidency. Because with the presidency, the exact opposite thing happened. Starting out, the framers did not fear the presidency being able to spin out of control and abuse its power in the same way that Congress could. So think about it. Because the framers weren't afraid of the presidency, the framers did not see the need to carefully specify, to carefully and in a detailed way lay out what the president could and could not do in Article 2 of the Constitution. So, if you go online and you pull up a copy of the US Constitution, and if you were able to look at Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 side by side, right? Article 1 dealing with Congress, Article 2 dealing with the president, Article 3 dealing with the courts, which we'll talk about next week. Article 1, and you don't even need to read the three articles in detail, just do a quick visual inspection. You will notice that Article 1 is by far the most detailed and the most lengthy of the three. The framers say a whole lot more about Congress than they do about the presidency. Article 2, dealing with the presidency, is significantly more brief and vague than Article 1. As we'll see next week, Article 3, dealing with the courts, for a variety of reasons, is barely there at all. It is extremely short and extremely vague, right? As a matter of fact, Article 2, dealing with the presidency, is so short and so vague that some constitutional historians have, I think, only half jokingly suggested that the framers created Article 2 one night during happy hour, during one of the pubs that they hung out during the convention in downtown Philadelphia. And the reason that they make that suggestion is because Article 2 is so brief and so vague that it probably could have been written on the back of a cocktail napkin. Now, is that the truth? Did that really happen? Probably not. Is it fun to think about? It absolutely is, right? But it gives you an idea. The framers just didn't sweat the details with the presidency in the same way that they did with Congress, because they just didn't see the need to. They just didn't see the president spinning out of control and abusing its power in the way that the president did, or that the Congress did, I should say. Yeah.
Is part of that also because of the electoral college that they set up? They felt like they could keep the selection of the president more specific?
That certainly is part of it, I think, because, you know, I think they hoped that, you know, since the ordinary voter, the ordinary elite voter, oddly enough, but the ordinary voter wouldn't directly choose the president, but would only select the people who would select the president. They felt that, you know, having that indirect role from voters would help to guarantee that you would have a better choice as president. Though the framers were still, some framers were still rather concerned about the possibility of getting a president who was perhaps unbalanced or power hungry or that sort of thing. But in the end, there were nowhere near the same structural controls on presidential authority as there were for Congress. Article 2 is pretty brief and pretty vague. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's weird. That doesn't make sense, right? Because if you were to ask Americans today, even before the current resident of the White House. So even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 40 years ago, if you were to ask Americans, okay, of the three national government branches, Congress, president, courts, which one is in your mind the most powerful and the most potentially dangerous? Just about everyone's going to say the president, right? So that's a really interesting question. How did we get from there to here? How did we get from the framers not fearing the president spinning out of control and abusing its power to today, where lots of us fear the president becoming too powerful and spinning out of control, especially since the 1970s, the Watergate scandal involving Richard Nixon, and kind of moving on forward until the present day? What accounts for that? How did we get from there to here? Well, guess what? In part, it's the framers' fault. We can blame the framers for the fact that modern presidents are extremely powerful, just like we could blame the framers for the fact that Congress today is a whole lot more weak than they thought it was going to be. And here's why. As we already said, because the framers didn't fear the president, they did not see the need to put a lot of detail into Article 2 of the Constitution regarding what the president could and could not do. Article 2 is pretty brief and pretty vague. Now, if you take a look at point capital B under Roman numeral number 1 in your notes, what I tell you is that modern presidents, and by modern presidents, I mean presidents starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who becomes president for the first time in 1932, takes over from Herbert Hoover in the depths of the Great Depression. So starting with FDR, and every president since and including FDR, every president from both parties, it doesn't matter, every modern president has taken steps to significantly increase their levels of power and authority by exploiting the lack of detail, by exploiting the vagueness in Article 2. And if you take a look at the second sentence there in point capital B under Roman numeral number 1, I make a statement that, you know, without context, you might think I'm kind of out of my mind when I say it. Maybe not. I say that in this sense, modern presidents are a lot like 2-year-olds, constantly testing the limits of what they can get away with before their caregivers, Congress, the courts, and the American people tell them to stop. And that's the reality. Starting with FDR, American presidents have taken steps, very conscious steps, to increase the amount of power they have as president. And they'll take on as much power as they can until someone outside of the presidency tries to put the brakes on them. And sometimes that's not even successful, right? And folks, that's every president since and including FDR. Not just Democratic presidents or Republican presidents, it's every president, okay? Now, if we were to ask every president since and including FDR, about this, they would probably say, well, I have no choice. I had to do that. It was necessary for the good of the country for me to expand my authority. Because here's the thing. A lot of presidents, before they actually become president, and even when they're running for president, will say, you know what? If you elect me president, I will not become power hungry. I will not seek to expand my authority, okay? Because it's just not necessary to do so. For example, back when Barack Obama was Senator Barack Obama representing the state of Illinois, when he was in the Senate under the George W. Bush presidency, Obama was incredibly critical of George W. Bush and said that the Bush administration was abusing its authority, that George Bush was taking on powers as president that were unnecessary, even to respond to situations like 9/11, that it was abuse of power. And when Senator Obama became presidential candidate Obama, he said, I am going to be very mindful of my power as president, and I will not seek to expand it. But then when candidate Obama became President Obama, his tune changed. And I'm not putting any sinister implications as to why his tune changed. He said what pretty much every modern president has said once they become president, and they said, oh my God, if I had only known back before I became president what was required of presidents to keep the country safe, I would never have denied the ability of presidents to be as powerful as they need to be. I think President Obama said one time, until you're president and until the phone rings at 3 a.m, meaning some emergency is broken out somewhere in the world that you have to deal with, until that happens to you, you cannot appreciate the need for significant, substantial presidential authority. And that's every modern president, Republican and Democrat, okay? They all seek to expand their powers, sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes maybe not for the right reasons, but they all do it. And that's why, starting with FDR, we see the power of the presidency increase exponentially between the 1930s and the present day. That's why most people who study this stuff, and a lot of people who don't, say, hey, the president of the United States is the single most powerful individual in the world, period, end of statement. Now, how have modern presidents been able to exploit their power and grow their power? Because of the lack of detail in Article 2. Article 2 does not clearly specify what the president should do, how far the president should go, and how far is too far. And so we've seen countless examples of this over time, where a president takes some action and someone in Congress or elsewhere says, hey, Mr. President, you can't do that. Article 2 doesn't say that you can do that. And the president can authoritatively reply and say, well, Article 2 may not say that I can do this, but it also doesn't say that I can't do this, right? So in some sense, the lack of detail in Article 2 gives presidents not a completely blank check to increase power at their will, but a significant ability for them to increase their power at their will when they see it to be necessary. Now, it doesn't always work, right? Sometimes the president will try to take a particular action and the president gets pushback, usually from the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court, because as we'll see when we talk about the court's judicial branch next week, it is the federal courts and in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court that has the ultimate authority to tell us what the Constitution says and what it doesn't say. So sometimes courts will foil a presidential attempt at expansion of power, but most of the time they don't. Most of the time they give the president pretty broad latitude to figure out what powers the president needs to execute the responsibilities of their office. So does that make sense? Questions, comments about any of this stuff so far? And either unmute your mic or put something in the group chat. Go ahead.
It all makes sense, except for I still feel like I don't understand why they didn't see this coming. Why didn't the framers take more caution with this? Like, why did they expect that this branch, for some reason, would be different? Is it just because of the experience of the Parliament and the House of Commons?
That's part of it. And there's another factor that at first is going to sound utterly ridiculous to you, but bear with me. It makes sense when you think of it in context. The framers assumed that all presidents, or at least most of the framers anyway, they assumed that all presidents of the United States would be like George Washington. Now, I know that's patently ridiculous on its face, right? But here's the thing. As the framers were creating the presidency, at least once after Alexander Hamilton tried to become president for life and he failed miserably, as we talked about at the beginning of the semester. As the framers were creating the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution, pretty much everyone in the room knew that the first president of the United States was going to be George Washington, because even by 1787, he was the most popular, the most well-known, the most beloved person in the United States. So it was kind of a foregone conclusion. He would be the first president, right? And, you know, think about all of the historical myth that has, surrounded George Washington. No doubt when you were in elementary school, you heard the story about George Washington and the cherry tree on his father's farm, and how George Washington, even as a child, was so good and pure that he could not tell a lie. And maybe you heard this story, maybe you haven't. So supposedly one day, little George Washington was wandering around his dad's farm and his dad was away from the place for doing whatever he was doing. And George Washington came upon this small cherry tree. And for whatever reason, little George got a wild hair and decided, you know what, I'm going to cut this thing down. So he got out his little axe and he whacked down the cherry tree. And the story then goes that when George Washington's dad gets back to the farm, he was pissed. And he goes up to George and says, hey, do you know anything about this? Who cut down the cherry tree? And George Washington, the future father of our country, said, Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I who cut down your cherry tree. Well, folks, that's myth. That never happened. And just a few years ago, we got great evidence, great scientific evidence to indicate that that never happened. Why? A few years ago, a group of archaeology students were doing a dig on the site of what was George Washington's father's farm. And what they figured out, they found no archaeological evidence to indicate that cherry trees had ever grown on that site. So forget that story. But despite the fact that that was myth, Washington was this incredibly highly regarded individual. And actually, honestly, he kind of successfully lived out that reputation as president. Now, is that to say that Washington never engaged in power politics? Well, of course he did. Washington was a player as much as any other elected official was. But Washington was not power hungry. Washington was not a tyrant. And we know this because Washington, back originally, the framers put no term limit on the presidency. Someone could serve as president for as many terms as they could get elected to. So Washington was overwhelmingly, resoundingly elected to his first term, then his second term. And everybody, including his left-hand person, Alexander Hamilton, assumed that he would run for a third term. George Washington was so popular in the United States that he could have been president for life if he had wanted to be. He could have gotten elected and reelected and reelected and reelected until the day he dropped dead. But he chose not to. He chose to step away after his second term, to not seek a third term as president. And if you're a fan of the musical Hamilton, they talk about this a lot. In fact, there's an entire song devoted to it. If you're familiar with the score, the song One Last Time is all about that. And in the song, Washington's explaining to Hamilton why he is stepping down as president, why he's not seeking a third term. And he basically says, we need to teach the American people how to say goodbye. We have to show them the resilience of our Constitution by showing them that we can have a peaceful transition of power, that a president can step down and a new president can peacefully be elected to take his place and carry on. So Washington was that guy. He probably could tell a lie, but he wasn't power hungry. And so what that means is that, and the framers just kind of assumed that all presidents were going to be like that. And so they said, well, we really just don't need to put all these protections in. Plus the Electoral College, all this other stuff, it's going to be fine. Most of the framers, though Hamilton was an exception, most of the framers could never have envisioned a controversial president, perhaps like the one we have now, or like a Richard Nixon, for example. Okay. Now, we are actually running a minute overtime, so let me just take a couple of minutes, make a couple of other quick references to the notes, and then send you off on your way to hopefully a lovely weekend, even under these circumstances. We got to do what we can do. Now, I do want to call your attention to what I talk about in Roman numeral number 2, right? And that is the key to success. Why is it that some American presidents in our history have been more successful and more effective than others? Well, there's been all this stuff written about presidential success and the keys to presidential success by political scientists, by historians, by folks in the media, by folks who may not know what they're talking about, all this kind of stuff. And most of the presidential success literature, and there's a ton of it, is absolute garbage. It's not worth the paper it's printed on, right? But based on all the research, there's one thing that we can say with a lot of confidence. The most successful and effective presidents in the history of the United States have been those presidents who have been able to build and maintain high levels of public support. So in other words, publicly popular presidents tend to be able to get more done. They tend to be more effective than presidents with a lower level of public popularity. Why? Because these very popular presidents in the eyes of the public have been able to use that popularity to move the American people, to put pressure on members of Congress, to do things that members of Congress might not want to do. And they say, here's what the president wants. Do what the president wants. And if you don't do what the president wants, maybe we won't vote for you next time when you're up for re-election.
So the re-election obsession sort of
plays a role there too.
Again.
Yeah. And you see this, if you look at every president for as long as we've been keeping records about, public attitudes towards the president, levels of presidential popularity, that sort of thing, the best, most successful presidents have been the ones that have been consistently able to build and maintain high levels of public support. And the ones that haven't been, just haven't gotten that much done. So that's a really important key. Now, last thing to mention, if you look at Roman numeral number 4, the big section of the notes, that lays out and discusses each of the 5 main functions of the presidency, each of the 5 chiefs of the presidency, as I like to call them. And what you will notice, and in a bunch of those, I give you examples illustrating either how modern presidents have expanded their power in those areas by taking advantage of the lack of detail in the Constitution in those areas, or how more publicly popular presidents are able to use some of those powers more effectively. So basically, most of the notes just help to reinforce the 2 major points that I've emphasized with you so far this morning, okay? So any last-minute questions either about the presidency or anything else having to do with the class before we wrap things up for a Friday morning? Anybody? And of course, if anybody would like to stay behind after we're formally done with this and ask more questions, or whatever, I'm open to that as well, okay? So between now and next Friday, if you need me for anything, questions, comments, anything that you think I can help you with, if you just need to vent for a few minutes, email me, send me a Canvas message, stop by my virtual student hours on Monday or Wednesday afternoons, or if you need to, send me a message. If you like to do a one-on-one Zoom appointment, we'll work it out and get that done as well, okay? So remember, your Congress discussion post is due tonight at 11:59 p.m., plus the 3-day grace period. Your next assignment due next Friday, again, plus the grace period, will be the discussion forum post that's available for you now dealing with the presidency, and start expecting to see your grades for test number 2 pop up onto Canvas later today. All right. So as always, we are going to get through all of this. We are going to be successful in this class and successful in getting through this extraordinary situation that we are living through together. Remember, you are not alone. I'm always here for you. I've got your back. So until I see you next time, stay safe, be well, and I'll see you online. Take care. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
I wanted to let you know that I just got accepted to Berkeley. So I'm very excited. Yeah, it's very exciting.
You can see me. I'm actually standing up. Can I stand up and applaud? Yes, there we go.
Thank you.
Congratulations. That is so wonderful.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's very exciting. And was that your first choice?
Yeah. Definitely. It was a dream school for sure. So I'm really excited.
I'm so proud of you. Berkeley is going to be so lucky to have you.
Thank you.
No, I mean, you are really going to make your mark there. I have no doubt about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm telling all my professors because I feel like, thank you.
No, that's fabulous. I'm very excited about that. And for those of you who are still with me, if you are about to transfer and as you start, hearing about where you're going to possibly be going, please let me know. This is one of the greatest things, it's one of the great kinds of feedback that a professor can get, because obviously my main objective is your success, and part of your success is your ability to be able to get to where you want to go for the next step, for transfer. So that's really great. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
It's very exciting. So I'm pleased. It's interesting because everything is online, and they're planning on everything being online in the fall as well. So it's going to be different. That's for sure.
It's going to be a really interesting transition. But, I mean, and it's a really kind of a weird introduction to a new institution. But, I guess if anything, hopefully the online experience that you've had here at LBCC this semester will stand you in good stead. So it won't be, especially because a lot of students and instructors too have never done online before, right? And so it can be, it's kind of like, oh my God, so at least you won't be going into that experience cold, so to speak. You've already will have had some experience, but I'm hoping that, once we get past fall semester, they'll be able to open up. You can head out there and have the face-to-face experience and have everything that brings, because, Berkeley is just a really unique experience in itself.
Yeah. The whole environment is pretty awesome. Although I will say they've been working overtime to make sure that we feel attended to and like a part of the community, even before accepting admission. Like I get 2 or 3 emails from them a day. And I was accepted to a couple other schools as well, and haven't been like the communication has not been anywhere near what Berkeley has.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're being very smart, right? Because I mean, let's face it. This is such a weird situation that, I'm sure they have this worry that, they find if some of their incoming students, whether they be freshmen or transfer students, and say, well, guess what? We're fully online. So you're not even showing up to campus next fall. They're kind of like, well, should I rethink my choice?
For sure.
Do I really want to go here?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
exactly.
So I'm glad that they're being, really on top of things. That makes me happy to hear, because
it makes me feel like my education won't be too compromised.
Exactly.
Because they're really working hard to make sure that we still get everything that we might want or need. So it's an interesting.
No, that's very good. That's very good to hear. And I hope that a lot of other institutions do the same thing, because it matters, because this is weird for most students, right?
For sure. For everyone.
Well, there are a small percentage of students who, are really comfortable with the online, and they take as many of their classes as they can online, and it really works for them. But for the bulk of them, and I think for a lot of us as instructors too, it's just so different. And it just doesn't work as well for a lot of people's learning styles. So
for sure. Is it, are you guys going to continue this in the fall, the online? Is Long Beach City? Do you know?
We don't know yet. The latest thing they're looking at multiple possibilities, and basically what administration is saying right now is that they're kind of, they're coming up with multiple options about how to deal with the fall, and they're going to need, guidance from the state, from the county, from the city of Long Beach. They have to figure out kind of where this is going to go and understand what's going to be the best and allowable option, for the fall. Obviously, we know for the summer, we are completely online. So I'm actually going to be teaching 2 sections of Poli-Sci 1 online in a 5-week format. That's going to be interesting.
Jesus.
Yeah, do this in 5 weeks. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
So, but so we know fall. I mean, we know summer, but fall is still up in the air. And and this is just me speculating, so take it for what it's worth. I have a feeling that fall could be either completely online, or it could be we start off the semester online and then have an option for going hybrid, partially online. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. There are people, you know, who have a lot more knowledge about this and who make a lot more money than I do, who will make those decisions.
Right.
So
clearly, leave it to them.
yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
way above my pay grade.
Yeah. Yeah.
Essentially. So that's kind of a good thing.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And so we will have to be talking as the semester goes on, because since you're going to Berkeley, a very dear friend of mine, former teaching partner of mine, we used to do learning communities together back when I was an adjunct at Pasadena City College.
Oh,
He's
wow.
he's a historian, so he is a big he is a big deal out there. He's not at Berkeley. He's at San Francisco State,
Yeah.
but he's a Berkeley alum.
Okay.
And so if you have any, you know, issues, especially once you move out there,
Yeah.
any issues with transition, or you just need to know a friendly and supportive person out there,
Yeah. Great.
he's your guy. So I will make sure that I connect you with him.
Please, that would be great. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, just because like I know so much of your educational experience has to do with the mentors that you find and the faculty that you engage with. And I'm not like, because I'm a returning student, I'm not so interested in like having the college experience as far as like being in the dorms and making you know, I'm more interested almost in the peers that I meet with respect to the teachers. So just having guidance with respect to the best way to approach faculty, and like if being a student assistant is a good way to make connections or to build relationships with people, or if he even knows any of the professors there and says like, this is somebody that you need to take a class from, or these are people that you need to work with, or whatever, that would be huge.
He knows tons of people.
That would be great.
So yeah, he is really plugged in and a
really
really active alum, and you know,
I would
all of that stuff. So,
I would love his help, because I'm also struggling a little bit with respect to my major, because I have specific interests with respect to like, I know I'm interested in the humanities. I love the social sciences, and I love sort of English literature comp kind of stuff.
Oh boy. Okay.
But I'm right now going in as a philosophy major. I don't really want to spend my entire time at Berkeley reading about Kant's theories, and you know, like I really like would like to broaden my field of interest, but I don't know like how to do that, or where to go with that, or what the best option is for that. And if there's professors at Berkeley that are specific, that are like comp lit professors or poli-sci professors or English professors that are just extraordinary, then I could do my
and there are, trust me, there really are, and some that are very, you know, multidisciplinary in their approach anyway. So yeah, I'm sure he'll have some ideas about that.
That would be great. Yeah. And as far as like what I want to do with my degree, I have no idea. So I'm sort of like, we'll just, that's one step at a time.
That's most of us, right? Yeah, that's most of us. But you know, what I found, because you know, I changed majors. I started out, this may shock some of you, but I started out as a business major.
Oh.
And I was, you know, and I got into, you know, a really top business program, and was doing really well, was successful in my lower division classes and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, just something seemed to be missing. And so I took my first poli-sci class as a GE, you know, basically poli-sci 1. Had an absolutely horrible experience. It was just awful, right? You know, I did fine. I was successful. It's kind of like, oh my Lord, you know, yeah, it's like, and so for whatever reason, I ended up signing up for a second poli-sci class again as GE. And that is our equivalent course here is poli-sci 2, comparative government and politics. And I had an experience, I mean, it was just amazing. It was just one of those transcendent learning experiences, because of the material, because of the instructor, because of the way the instructor presented the material, and just because of who the instructor was as a person. And that just opened my eyes, and I changed majors.
It makes
And
such a difference. It's insane.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
She goes crazy with the mailman. So every time the mailman comes, she's like a maniac.
Mine too. The mailman, the UPS man, the Amazon Prime man, you know, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, no one's ever coming in our house without us knowing. That's
that's a good thing.
That's definitely. But no, I mean, I was saying to my parents actually this morning, like, I never thought I'd be interested in political science, but I love your class, and I'm so sad that we don't get to have your 3-hour lectures, because I just really appreciate.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel the same way, you know. But you know, it just, you know, with this format, and I know there are some instructors on campus that are running their classes through Zoom completely synchronously. And, you know, what I found, because, you know, we were initially told don't do that. And what I found, I have enough of my students, you know, their schedules have become so disrupted and so unpredictable, and their access to technology is so unpredictable as a result of all of this going on around us, that they just can't deal with a completely synchronous class. And so that's why I've kind of created kind of this in between, so that you know, we have some ability to get together, you know, live week to week for those of us who want to and who are able to, but yet we also have, you know, most everything done in an asynchronous way, so that people can get their work done when they have the time, when they have the ability to do so. But yeah, I mean, my preference is I want to be live in person, face to face with you guys, you know, 3+ hours a week.
Yeah.
Because that's the most fun. But you know, we make the best of what we got.
Exactly. We do what we can do. That's for sure. Well, thank you again. I won't keep you any longer.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So anybody have anything else they want to bring up or talk about before I go ahead and end our meeting for today? Thank you all for sticking around. It makes me, it's kind of nice. We kind of get to have like the after class conversations that we did when we were face to face. And I really appreciate that, because I miss you guys.
Yeah.
I miss seeing you guys on a regular basis. That is really a big part of the joy of what I do. Oh, Sarah said I got into Cal State LA. Yay.
Thank you.
I will stand up and applaud for Sarah as well. That's fantastic. And what's the major going to be for you, Sarah? Are you decided?
Yeah, for exercise science.
That's fabulous. That's a great field. And
yeah, I want to do occupational therapy.
That's so awesome.
Good for you. That is wonderful. That's very exciting. I've actually heard really good things about the exercise science program over at Cal State LA. So good for you. I'm really proud of you.
Thank you.
Yay.
That is exciting. Now, have you heard from them? Is there, because Cal State LA is on quarters, right? Aren't they? Or am I dreaming?
I'm not sure. I think I honestly don't know.
Whatever. But I mean, have they said decisively for fall what they're going to do? If fall is going to be online or in person, or a combination thereof?
They haven't said anything about it yet. They're kind of doing it as if it's going to be in person, because they're doing like the housing the same way that they would for fall.
Well, they have to figure that stuff out just in case it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, they haven't said anything.
Interesting.
I have a friend of mine who's going to Cal Poly, and he was saying the same thing, like that there's nothing really specific that's going on.
I think we're all really kind of in kind of a holding pattern right now. We're all waiting to kind of see, you know, what goes on, what the federal government says, and probably more importantly, what the state government says.
Yeah.
You know, and the county and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. So you have to plan for every possibility, which I would not want to be an administrator right now, because their job.
No.
I mean, I think my job's complicated by all of this. Their job must be insane because of all of this.
Yeah, not fun. Not fun. So.
Well, that's so exciting. Boy, that's one of the things I love about this time of year, getting to hear where everybody's going and what they're going to be doing and all of that.
Yeah. That's cool. And whenever you get a chance to send the information for that, guys, if you wouldn't mind, I would jump on contacting him right away. That would be really great.
Yep, I will do that. I will just, I'm just going to, I always verify with him that it's okay that I do.
Of course. You're not just giving his information out to
me.
Oh
no, but he's fine. He is very much like me. So hopefully that's a good thing. But he's always willing to go that extra mile for students. So cool. Obviously I'll verify because that's just the polite thing to do.
Clearly,
but I'm sure that won't be a problem, and I'll send you his information ASAP.
Awesome, thank you so much. It was nice to see you, Sarah. You should turn your camera on during the lecture.
Okay,
I'll feel like I'm not the only one that's sitting in class.
I'll join you.
I appreciate that. So, anybody else on anything for today? All right. Well, hang in there. Have a great weekend. Thank you for staying behind. I had a lot of fun this morning, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys. Bye, Sarah. Congrats again.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Maria.
Bye, Maria.
Bye.